name is Marla Spector, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Florida Law Review. I would like to thank you all for joining us this morning for the 4th annual Alan L. Poucher Legal Education Series. We are so very excited to present this year's topic, Legalize Marijuana, a conversation with experts. The Florida Law Review's Alan L. Poucher Legal Education Series was established by Betty Poucher, Elizabeth Poucher Reynolds, and Alan L. Poucher Jr. in honor of the late Alan L. Poucher Sr. The Poucher Lecture was created to promote the discussion of various legal, political, and business issues, and today's informed discussion would not be possible without the generous contributions of the Poucher family. We are so very delighted to have the Poucher family here with us today, and at this time, I would like to ask them to stand so we can thank them all for their continued support of the Florida Law Review and the Alan L. Poucher Legal Education Series. The Florida Law Review would also like to thank the Dean of the Levin College of Law, George Dawson, for his continued support. We are fortunate to be a part of a law school that encourages the discussion of various legal matters in a forum such as this. The entire Law Review has been involved in putting together today's event, and for that, I would like to thank all of our members, and of course, thank our staff editors, Lisa Caldwell and Angie Forder. Of course, I cannot forget to thank our amazing Executive Symposium editors, Matthew Chris and Dustin Mauser, for the remarkable work they've put in to making today's Poucher Lecture possible. Lastly, the review is grateful for the guidance we receive from our faculty advisor, the one and only Professor Dennis Calfee. His support and advice have been crucial to making Poucher a success year after year. On that note, I would like to introduce Dustin Mauser, one of our Executive Symposium editors, who will introduce today's panelists and our moderator. I hope everyone enjoys today's conversation and leaves the lecture with a more informed opinion on the hot topic of whether marijuana should be legalized. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this morning for this fascinating discussion about the legalization of marijuana. I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce you to the panelists who have kindly offered to join us here today. David Blake is the Deputy Attorney General for Legal Policy and Government Affairs of Colorado. Prior to joining the Colorado Department of Law in 2010, Blake served in a variety of roles with the U.S. Attorney General's Office, including Special Assistant U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia, Counsel to the Guantanamo Detainee Review Task Force, and as a trial attorney in the Civil Division. Subsequently, he was appointed to serve on a task force that proposed rules for recreational marijuana in Colorado after the state's voters legalized marijuana for recreational use in 2012. He recently co-authored an article, Marijuana Legalization in Colorado, Learned Lessons, which was published in the Harvard Law and Policy Review. It detailed how Colorado implemented a regulatory regime for marijuana. Blake is a graduate of George Mason University School of Law. Please welcome Deputy Attorney General David Blake. Our next panelist is Dr. Carl Hart, who is a tenured professor of psychology in both the departments of psychiatry and psychology at Columbia University and the director of the Residential Studies and Methamphetamine Research Laboratories at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. A major focus of Dr. Hart's research is to understand the complex interactions between drugs of abuse and the neurobiology and environmental factors that mediate human behavior and physiology. He is an author and co-author of dozens of peer-reviewed scientific articles in the area of neuropsychopharmacology. He co-authored the textbook Drugs, Society, and Human Behavior and is a member of the National Institutes of Health Review Group. He was awarded the 2014 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award for his memoir High Price for its compelling argument to reconsider the country's policies on drug use. Dr. Hart was recently elected to fellow status by the American Psychological Association and was recently awarded Columbia University's highest teaching award. Please welcome Dr. Carl Hart. Beau Kilmer is a senior policy researcher at RAND Corporation, where he co-directs the RAND Drug Policy Research Center. He is also a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. His research lies at the intersection of public health and public safety, with a special emphasis on substance abuse, illicit markets, crime, and public policy. Some of his current projects include estimating the size of illegal drug markets, assessing the consequences of alternative marijuana policies, and measuring the effect of South Dakota's 24/7 sobriety program on drunk driving and domestic violence outcomes. Kilmer's research has appeared in leading journals such as Addiction and American Journal of Public Health, and his commentaries have been published by prominent print, television, and radio media outlets. He is a co-author of the book, Marijuana Legalization, What Everyone Needs to Know. Before earning his doctorate at Harvard University, Kilmer received a Judicial Administration Fellowship that supported his work with the San Francisco Drug Court. Please welcome Dr. Beau Kilmer. Bertha Madras is a professor of psychobiology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, currently at McLean Hospital, and chair of the Harvard Medical School's NEPRC Division of Neurochemistry. In public policy, she was nominated by President George W. Bush and was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve as the Deputy Director for Demand Reduction in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. She promoted medicalization, evidence-based practices for treatment, and drug courts. She is the author of more than 170 scientific manuscripts, book chapters, and commentaries, and recently co-edited books on the effects of drug abuse on the human nervous system and the cell biology of addiction. She holds 19 patents and has served on over 50 National Institutes of Health committees, and is a current advisor to the NFL and U.S. Attorney's Office in California. She also directed a National Institute of Drug Abuse sponsored event at the Museum of Science in Boston entitled Changing Your Mind, Drugs in the Brain, which included an electronic teaching program licensed by Disney in 2006. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bertha K. Madras. Robert Mikos is one of the nation's leading experts on federalism and drug law. He is a professor of law at Vanderbilt University Law School, where he teaches courses in federalism, constitutional law, marijuana law and policy, federal criminal law, and drug law and policy. His most recent scholarship analyzes the struggle among federal, state, and local governments for control of marijuana law and policy. Last year, he principally authored an amicus curiae brief which argued that Congress could not preempt Michigan's medicinal marijuana law. He has also written on the state's constitutional authority to withhold information from the government, the political safeguards of federalism, accuracy in criminal sanctions, the economics of the private precautions against crime, and remedies at private law. Professor Mikos earned his J.D. summa cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School, and after graduation clerked for the Chief Judge Michael Boudin of the U.S. Court of Appeal in the First Circuit. He is the author of a forthcoming textbook on marijuana law and policy by Aspen Publishers, which will be available in early 2016. Please welcome Professor Robert Mikos. Scott Teitelbaum is a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the University of Florida College of Medicine and is the vice chair of the psychiatry department. Dr. Teitelbaum is certified by the American Society of Addiction Medicine and directs the Florida Recovery Center, the state of Florida's premier treatment program for drug and alcohol addiction, which is located here at the University of Florida. Additionally, he is the immediate past president of the Florida Society of Addiction Medicine. He has been interviewed as a national expert for radio, television, and print media, and has been consulted by the White House Office of National Drug Control, the DEA, and the Executive Office of the President to help with the media campaign on the use of marijuana by children and adolescents. Dr. Teitelbaum was inducted into the Conway Hunter Society in 2010, a national recognition for his leadership in addiction medicine. He is a co-author of Weed, Family Guide to Marijuana Myths and Facts. Please welcome Dr. Scott Teitelbaum. And please join me in welcoming our team of experts. The format of today's discussion will be a conversation among the panelists that is facilitated with questions posed from a moderator. In order to be courteous to our panelists, we ask that you please turn your cell phones on silent, do not take any flash photos, and refrain from talking during the discussion. Our moderator for this event is Matthew Christ. Matt is a third-year law student at the University of Florida Levin College of Law and serves as an executive symposium editor on the Florida Law Review. Please join me in welcoming Matt Christ to the stage.
Well, as you can tell from Destin's introduction, we are extremely lucky to have such a great group of experts with us today to talk about marijuana legalization. You know, the plant cannabis has been cloaked with stigma, the result of years of prohibition at both the state and federal level. Undoubtedly, there are both valid and invalid reasons for its controversial reputation. But if public opinion polls mean anything, their reputation is becoming less controversial. In 2008, just 35% of Americans believed that marijuana should be legal. Jump forward to 2012, that number had surged to 52%. According to a Wall Street Journal NBC News poll conducted earlier this year, today, more Americans believe that that sugar is more harmful than marijuana to one's health. This dramatic shift in public opinion has driven changes in state law, at the state level. 23 states have now legalized marijuana for medical use. Florida may soon add to that if voters approve Amendment 2 in this state, which would legalize medical marijuana. 2 other states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, also have similar ballot initiatives in November. And then 2 states in the District of Columbia are considering this November of legalizing marijuana for recreational use. And in 2012, 2 states did just that, Washington and Colorado, making them the only places in the world where marijuana is essentially legal. And I have to say essentially because the federal government still bans marijuana. So given the increasing public acceptance of marijuana, and assuming that Colorado's and Washington's experiment with legalization doesn't result in any unintended or unexpected consequences to public health, safety, and welfare, it's a good bet. It's not difficult to imagine more states legalizing marijuana in the near future. As a Brookings Institute report noted earlier this year, or last year, momentum is definitely on the side of those favoring legalization. That means it's clear then that this topic, the topic of marijuana legalization, is here with us to stay. Which is distressing. Not because I or the Florida Law Review have any opinion one way or the other about marijuana legalization, but because the conversation that's taking place today over TV, over our airwaves, online, and our newspapers, is largely a discussion not based on evidence and facts and research, but one based on unsubstantiated opinions and anecdotal evidence about why marijuana shouldn't be legalized, whether marijuana should or should not be used for medicinal purposes, and whether arresting people for marijuana possession is or is not a good idea for public policy. It seems then that there are 2 extremes in popular culture about marijuana. On one extreme, marijuana is a gateway drug that leads to a life of crime and to trying more illicit and harder substances such as cocaine and heroin. And on the other extreme, marijuana is just a gateway to the nearest supermarket snack aisle. I'm fairly confident that our panelists will agree that the topic, marijuana legalization, this issue, is far more nuanced than that. We're going to explore those nuances today. We're going to explore those nuances and tease out the facts relating to the public policy issues surrounding legalization, the medical efficacy of marijuana, the social consequences of our current drug policy, and the probable consequences of legalization, as well as the hurdles to improving our knowledge, our scientific knowledge about this substance, a substance which 18 million Americans regularly use. So this is not intended to be an adversarial debate. It's intended to be an open, engaging, inclusive conversation, inclusive to all ideas about this topic from our panelists, as long as they are supported by facts, evidence, research, and professional experience. So let's start that conversation right now. I'm going to start with Dr. Kilmer. First of all, thank you all for, gotta do that first. Thank you all for, flying in. Dr. Kilmer, you flew in from LA, so you've got the lucky ticket. You flew in the farthest. I'm going to start with a tall order here. Can you give us just a brief history of American marijuana policy?
Well, we've had an hour or two talking about that. The idea of marijuana prohibition is actually a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, step back, in some cultures, they've used marijuana for thousands of years for medicinal or therapeutic or for spiritual reasons. And even in the late 1800s in the United States, cannabis extracts were used for medicinal purposes, for relieving pain, reducing restlessness. It was advertised in kind of pharmacy journals. But it wasn't until the early 1900s when marijuana actually began to be used as an intoxicant in the United States, or became more popularly used as an intoxicant. And it was in the early 1900s that actually a number of states, before the federal government, actually began to prohibit marijuana. And they did this for a number of different reasons, but you can't deny the role that race and ethnicity played in some of those early decisions. Marijuana smoking was closely tied with some of the Mexican immigrants that had been coming to the United States. And as there was more of a backlash against the Mexican immigrants because of the Great Depression, people saw that as an opportunity to begin to crack down on marijuana. There were also strong ties between marijuana use and the African-American jazz communities. So there were a number of reasons, and in some places the white majority did not like that. And so there were a number of reasons why states actually began banning marijuana, in the early 1900s. But it wasn't until 1937 that the federal government, when they passed the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act, that pretty much prohibited marijuana, or possession of marijuana, to be used as an intoxicant. Then fast forward to 1970, and that's when you had the passage of the Controlled Substances Act. And we've got some experts on this panel, so I'm not going to spend too much time getting into the details. But essentially what that act did is it placed all psychoactive drugs into 5 different schedules, with Schedule 1 being the category for the most dangerous drugs. That is, those that had no currently accepted medical use and those where there was a high potential for abuse. Heroin is in that category, LSD is in that category, and so is marijuana. And that's where it remains today. In the 1970s, you then began to saw some states, they began to decriminalize marijuana. And it's important to understand that there's a difference between decriminalizing and legalizing. When people talk about decriminalizing, they're typically referring to reducing the penalties for possession for small amounts. For example, having to go from being a misdemeanor to something more like a traffic ticket. So you had 12 states decriminalize marijuana in the 1970s. South Dakota did, but then they actually recriminalized. And then you've had a few other states decriminalized since then. You had a federal program for medical marijuana that was soon canceled. But the real conversation about medical marijuana got started in the mid-90s when California passed Proposition 215. And Matt, as you mentioned, since then, 23 states now make allowances for medical marijuana. And that's in addition to the 11 states that have passed CBD-only laws in 2014. And so you've had this influx of voter initiatives, but also legislative bills that are now making these allowances for marijuana and are for marijuana to be used for medical purposes. And yeah, it was in November of 2012 that Colorado and Washington State became the first jurisdiction in the world to remove the prohibition prohibition on marijuana and actually allow for-profit companies to come in and begin producing this. And this is really interesting. I mean, a lot of people think, well, didn't they already legalize marijuana in the Netherlands? No, that's not the case. Yes, if you're over 18, you can walk into one of those coffee shops and buy up to 5 grams, because they have an official policy of not enforcing the law against small-scale transactions. But it's still illegal to grow and sell the marijuana there. So you can't just look to the Netherlands to get insights about what marijuana legalization would look like here. But for us researchers, what we were really interested in seeing is, well, after these initiatives passed, well, what was the federal government going to do? Because as Matt suggested, this is still all illegal under federal law. So we just kind of kept waiting and waiting and waiting, and David, I know you were especially waiting to see what they would do. But it wasn't until August of 2013 that the federal government, they released, the Department of Justice released the Cole memo. And essentially what that said was, for the time being, they weren't going to block implementation efforts in Washington and Colorado as long as there were strong regulatory and enforcement systems in place. But they made it very clear that they weren't legalizing marijuana at the federal level, and they also said, hey, federal prosecutors, if you want to go after marijuana trafficking cases, here are kind of 8 different guidelines. If they're selling to kids, serving as fronts for organized crime, you should go after them. So it really has been this, there's been a lot of change over the past few years, and the one thing to keep in mind is that this is a federal policy, and we're going to have a new president in January of 2017. So it'll be very interesting to see if that individual kind of continues with what the Obama administration is doing, or whether or not they'll do something else.
Well, thank you for that. That's great context. I think we could spend probably 2 or 3 hours on this. As you mentioned, marijuana is a Schedule I drug. There are other substances. It's the most restrictive schedule. There are other substances that are less restrictive, such as cocaine, which I believe is Schedule II. There's a case in a federal court, the Eastern District of California, which granted an evidentiary hearing on a motion challenging the constitutionality of classifying marijuana as a Schedule I substance. And the hearing is set for this Monday. And wouldn't luck have it, but we have 2 of the expert witnesses with us today who will be discussing that issue in federal court. Dr. Madras, you're the expert witness for the U.S. government. Why should marijuana remain a Schedule I substance?
Well, frankly, I am not permitted to discuss the case until it is. So, but I can answer that in general terms. There are 3 reasons for placing a drug into Schedule I, or in any drug schedule. One is it has a high potential for abuse. The second issue, it has no medical purpose. And the third issue is that the drug does not have a proven safety standard. And so I can readily address these. There is, with regard to the abuse potential, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which defines psychiatric disorders, has clearly defined marijuana use disorder or cannabis use disorder as one of the diagnostic criteria. This has been controversial amongst the psychiatric community for years, but the predecessor to this manual, which was DSM-4, had already recognized that there is a cannabis dependence or use disorder, which clearly was based on evidence, strong, powerful evidence, so that the potential for abuse is high. Secondly, the medicinal properties of cannabis, although this is being debated currently in this constitutional amendment in Florida, I can quote a number of databases, including the Cochrane database, which scans all the medical literature on the medicinal uses of cannabinoids as well as marijuana, as well as other meta-analyses of data that have been produced over the years. And right now, there is insufficient evidence to claim that marijuana has medical purposes with regard to FDA standards. These standards of the Food and Drug Administration, which came into effect in 1938 and have protected Americans from false claims, dangerous drugs, have evolved over the past 70 years into a system that is amongst the best, if not the best in the world. And from my perspective, as well as the legal and FDA perspective, one has to succeed in fulfilling these FDA standards before a drug is approved for medical purposes. The claims that I have seen amongst multiple states, including California, Connecticut, Illinois, I can go through most of them, are remarkable in lack of evidence. For Parkinson's, for Alzheimer's, for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the claims would not even begin to get into phase 1 clinical trials by FDA standards. So what I do think, and the final criterion is safety, and clearly there are safety issues evolving around the use of an intoxicant while trying to fulfill one's daily requirements and commitments. So from my perspective, there is a real issue with regard to the use of marijuana as for medical purposes based on scientific biomedical evidence using randomized controlled trials, and I can discuss many of them in terms of their strengths and weaknesses if there is an issue there. There is poor evidence that an intoxicating drug is a wise decision when alternatives may exist. And I certainly do think that in terms of compassionate concern for people who are in stages of diseases, we have to examine and try to accommodate the very narrow focus for those individuals.
So Dr. Hart, do you like to respond? Or?
Well, I think Dr. Madras gave a really nice overview about the issues in terms of abuse potential, in terms of the medical utility and safety. I think that's a great overview. When we think of abuse potential, when we think about drugs that are available, for example, this is a university. Amphetamines are available. You are a university, so you guys know Adderall, right? Well, maybe you don't. This is Florida. Adderall is an amphetamine, and it's approved. And it's approved to treat attention deficit disorder. And it certainly is one of these drugs that has abuse potential. So marijuana, it's clear it has abuse potential. Whether or not a drug has abuse potential, it's not a reason to make the drug illegal or to have it Schedule 1. Because when we think about marijuana's abuse potential, and then we think about something like Adderall, marijuana probably has less abuse potential than amphetamines. But amphetamines are important medications that we use in our country, and we use them safely. And then when we think about medical sort of utility, or are there any medical benefits from marijuana, there have been a number of government studies. What we didn't say is that I have conducted many of these studies along with my colleagues, and we certainly have shown that marijuana, for example, is as effective as Marinol, which is THC in a pill, is as effective at increasing food intake, which Marinol is approved for, particularly in AIDS wasting or chemotherapy related to cancer treatment. Marijuana is as effective as Marinol, and we've demonstrated that. Other people have demonstrated this in HIV positive people and people who are not HIV positive. And there's also some indication that marijuana is potentially useful in certain types of pain. But as Dr. Madras pointed out, she's absolutely right. Some of the claims that people are saying that marijuana is useful for, there are no scientific evidence for it. She's absolutely right. But when we think about approving a medication or moving it from Schedule 1 to a different schedule, that medication does not have to be effective for everything. That would be illogical. And when we think about safety and we think about intoxicating effects of drugs. Now, how many of you all have had something like dental pain? Well, you don't have to say. I'll tell you, I have had dental pain recently. I recently had a root canal. And so that's painful, really painful. And so I had some options. I could take ibuprofen, or I could take the prescribed Percocet, which contains OxyContin. OxyContin is an intoxicating sort of substance. I took the OxyContin because it was intoxicating. But at same token, I also am a college professor. And I had to go and teach my classes the next day and so forth, and I had other responsibility. I met her because I knew that I couldn't take the intoxicant when I had to go and work, but when it was time to sleep or relax, it was clear what my choice was. So the notion that marijuana should not be moved in terms of the schedule to Schedule 2 because it has some intoxicating effects, that might be moralistic. Give me my intoxicant.
We're gonna revisit, I guess, the medical side of this. Well, actually, Dr. Teitelbaum, sorry, would you like to add in?
Well, I don't want my intoxicant. I think that when you look at drugs with abuse liability, certainly I'm glad that you articulated. There's clearly addiction liability with marijuana, and I think that's unequivocal, and people have to accept that. So when you look at moving a substance to Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, from my end, and somebody that treats and evaluates people, I'm more concerned with when we make a substance legal and we decrease the perceived danger of the substance, that we're going to see increased use in younger people. And when you look at the studies and you look at the literature and you look at the monitoring the future study, one of the things at the University of Michigan, when you look at initiation of drugs in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade, one thing that has stood out since the 1970s, that is, as a drug is perceived more dangerous, it is less likely to be used, less likely to be initiated. And as a drug is seen as more dangerous, it's less likely to be used. And as seen safer, it's more likely to be used. So when you look at marijuana since the 70s, as the perceived danger went up, the use went down. And as the perceived danger goes up, use goes down. As use goes up, perceived danger goes down. So what are you going to have? You're going to have a population, a young population, that is going to see a drug that's a medicine and is going to see a drug that is legal. And I think you have to kind of look at public health issues and have to accept the fact that you're going to see more use in younger people. The other thing that people haven't talked about is potency. Back in those of us that did like our intoxicants when we were younger, the potency of marijuana was somewhere between 1 and 4%. And today's marijuana is about roughly about 13%. So it's a different drug today that we see. And I'm not sure, staying away from the Schedule 1 versus Schedule 2, I think that a medicine, any medicine, there's two things you don't do with medicines. You don't smoke them and you don't vote on them. So any substance that's a medication really ought to go through the same criteria than any other medicine. And there is a history here, and there are many medicines out there. Digoxin, which comes from the foxglove plant, which is a common medication for heart failure. I don't think there's anybody in Gainesville today or anywhere in the country smoking foxglove plant in their backyard for their heart contractility. And so I think we have to really be honest with ourselves. And if the discussion is whether or not a drug should be legal because people want the right to get high and want their intoxicants, that's a whole other conversation than trying to hide behind medication. The plant itself has 80 cannabinoids and 400 chemicals, and there are, as a pediatrician, there are kids with refractory seizures, and there's cannabidiol, which doesn't get you high, that has some efficacy. But like any other drug, you want to look at safety, you want to look at efficacy, and you want to prove it safe like any other drug. So, when I listen to the argument, I'm glad we're having a discussion today, which is the real issue. Really, the medicalization is a Trojan horse for legalization. And the real issue is, do people want the right to get high or not? And that's the discussion. And I think when you look at that, you have to be honest with yourself about what the possible public health effects will be with respect to driving, with respect to addiction liability, and some psychiatric issues. I think you have to really be honest with yourself, take a good look at it, and kind of put your opinion aside and really ask, well, I have this opinion, but what am I basing it on, and what am I going to have to deal with if it is legal?
I want to follow up with Dr. Kilmer. Your RAND Corporation has done studies, I believe, on states that have legalized marijuana for recreational medical use. Are you able to model, I guess, in advance, what's going to happen, if a state legalizes it for recreational use? How many more people are expected to use? How many more traffic fatalities? Is that possible to do?
You can try. When you're trying to project the consequences of legalization, that's very different from medical marijuana. Because go back to what I was saying before, we had decriminalization, which kind of reduced the penalties. Then you have medical marijuana, where in some states you can get it from dispensaries. But with legalization, it's just a very different policy option. Because with legalization, you're legalizing the production and the distribution costs. Or you're legalizing the production and distribution, and that really reduced the costs. Right now, when somebody purchases marijuana, heroin, or cocaine, a lot of what they're doing is compensating the drug dealers and everyone else along that supply chain for the risk of arrest and risk of incarceration. You legalize marijuana, that eventually goes away. You also expect there to be increasing returns to scale as you have industrial grows instead of people growing in their backyards and basements. So if you're actually trying to project what would happen with legalization, you have to first of all kind of build that in and think about, well, what's going to happen for a jurisdiction that legalizes? What are they going to do with production? Are they going to allow outdoor production? Which, just to kind of put this in perspective, if you want to get a pound of high-potency marijuana from one of the growers up in Northern California, right now to have it processed and have it dried, it's going to run you about $1,500. I mean, that cost has gone down quite a bit over the past 5-10 years. If you were to grow it outdoors, like any other agricultural commodity, be thinking, cherry tomatoes and asparagus, other plants they actually transplant, I mean, that can drive those production costs to less than $40 for that same pound. So it makes it really hard to make these projections about what would happen with legalization, because to do those calculations, and I've tried, I've got to have a good understanding of what type of production is going to be allowed, how many producers are going to be allowed, is it going to be taxed, what's that tax going to be, what types of testing regulations are there going to be, and so that's kind of where we're at as researchers right now, just really trying to figure out what are all those different, kind of decisions that have to be made. But getting back to some of the work, so right now it's very hard to project. I mean, anyone who tells me that they know it's going to be bad for public health or they know it's going to be good for public health, I would look at them skeptically, because you really don't know, because it really depends on those different details. But to get back to some of the research that some of my colleagues have done, a lot of people wonder, we've got 23 states that now make allowances for medical marijuana, how's it played out in those different states? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of variation in how medical marijuana has been implemented across the country. A lot of people, when they think about medical marijuana, they think about California, Colorado, where it's really easy to get a card and they got dispensaries all over the place. It's not like that everywhere. But what a lot of the research was doing up until recently is they were just looking at whether or not it was a medical marijuana state or not a medical marijuana state. And it turns out that's not the right way to go about that research. Because some states like California are very different from states like Rhode Island. So what you really want to do is you want to kind of look at the pieces of that. Is this a law that allows dispensaries? Is this a law that allows it to be used for chronic pain? Do they require a home registry? So to do the good research, you really kind of want to get in. It's not this kind of binary decision. And so my colleagues have a paper coming out where they're really trying to tease this out. And they do find that in places that do allow dispensaries, that you do see an increase in adult recreational use. However, they didn't find an effect on youth consumption. But like I said, you're just starting to kind of see this research now, and so I think before people pass judgment on medical marijuana, you're going to want to look at more research coming out. But you can't necessarily just take that medical marijuana research and apply it to the post-legalization world, because so much depends on the actual design considerations associated with legal marijuana.
Let's talk about the present. Marijuana isn't legal at the federal level, but we have a situation where 23 states have legalized it have basically said we know better, have legalized it for medicinal use. 2 states, as we mentioned earlier, have even used it for recreational use. Professor Mikos, what are the legal consequences of this. Shouldn't federal law preempt state law?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's a problem here that Beau identified in the sense that there's almost too many cooks in the kitchen right now. We have the national government that is espousing a strict prohibition policy. It's softened its stand a bit on enforcement of that policy, but it's still a law in the books. You have these states and the District of Columbia that have legalized possession, cultivation, and distribution of the drug. And then you also have local governments espousing their own marijuana policies. In some states that continue to prohibit marijuana, local governments are trying to legalize it. In some states, including Colorado, that have legalized marijuana, some local governments are trying to turn back the clock and prohibit it. And this phenomenon where you have these three different levels of government that all disagree about what the policy should look like, I think is causing a lot of headaches, and it means that we can't get a policy that anyone is going to be truly satisfied with. And part of the problem comes up because you do have the gorilla in the room, the federal government, which has this strong prohibition policy. The federal government, importantly, can't force states to criminalize marijuana. So the states are on pretty solid legal footing when they legalize it. A state can simply say, we don't care about this drug, we're not going to do anything about it. But a state can't go any further than that. A state can't obstruct federal prosecutions. So if the federal government wants to step in and prosecute people who are acting in compliance with state law, it could if it had the resources. And a state also can't do things that facilitate this conduct that is illegal under federal law. That's why states are struggling with things like employment protection for medical marijuana users. If you're a user of other legal drugs and your employer fires you for using the drug off the job when you have a doctor's position, that's considered employment discrimination under most state and even some federal laws. But when it comes to medical marijuana, it's a different story because it's illegal under federal law. So this dynamic where you have these three levels of government, all with their own intention and policies, I think it really creates a situation where we can't get to where we want to be. Whatever your position on the issue is, we can't get there under present circumstances.
And Mr. Blake, you served in the Department of Justice. Now you are Deputy Attorney General of Colorado. You've worked at the federal level, the state level. What's an ideal world? I'm assuming the federal level would be where we want to legalize it.
Did you say ideal
No.
world when we came to it?
No. I guess in an ideal world, if you were going to legalize something, if you're going to clear up this confusion that Professor Mikos just pointed out, you would want to have it decided at the federal level rather than the state level, or do you disagree?
No, of course. I mean, under the interstate commerce case law that's been established now for decades, this has to start and end at the federal level. They've occupied the space and therefore pushed out the states. And what the states are doing and what the proponents are doing is really a concerted strategy that you start with medicinal marijuana and in many ways pull on heartstrings. And there are cases out there, and I'm very outclassed on this particular panel as to speak on that. But suspending that, what we've seen in Colorado is really, I think, abuse. And that's something I haven't really heard here of responsible abuse by intoxicants and abuse by people who may take advantage. For example, in Colorado, when we had Amendment 20 passed in 2000, that's kind of lost on people. So for 9 years before the Justice Department put out its original guidance, we had about 3,500 registrants using medicinal marijuana. In 2009, with the risk assessment that went up, really the risk assessment that went down, we had people that were essentially drug dealers on Monday become small business owners on Wednesday. What happened was you had an increase, and the people that signed up for the registry, we went from in 9 months 3,500 to more than 100,000. That's a Chernobyl-like change in health in Colorado. We're the healthiest state in the nation, and all of a sudden we had 40-year-old average, 70% male, 94% of the registrants suffering severe pain. No, that's not what we created is a constitutional mechanism whereby people go into their doctors either fabricate or blow out of proportion the ailments that they're suffering from. And when people go and vote on these things, they picture in their mind, I think, infirm people, so people suffering from cancer, people truly trying to medicate themselves in very difficult situations, including being enabled by their families, to just simply recreational use. And so, even though this strategy is designed, you start with Charlotte's Web, and then you go to medicinal, and then ultimately, like in Colorado and Washington, you end up with recreational. And I think as a lawyer, I'd much prefer to just skip over that, these are my words, kind of constitutionally enshrined fraud between a doctor and their patient, and get right to recreational, because that's what we're seeing in these states, is recreational use, not medicinal. You can have recreational, and then a subclass of that is medicinal, overseen by your doctor if, in fact, you believe in the medicinal benefits. And I don't opine on whether there are or there not. These folks are much more well positioned to do that. But yeah, until the federal government acts at an FDA level, at a banking level, at a higher education, therefore enabling studies level, at the DEA and Justice Department level from an enforcement perspective, states are stuck with doing this experiment. And frankly, the industries are stuck with having this cloud hang over their head. The risk assessments have gone down, but they can never be eliminated.
Well, you mentioned that you had one day basically small-time drug dealers, and then the next day there were small business owners. What have been some of the legal consequences of this process in Colorado, where you have, you have people that have past convictions for marijuana possession, and then all of a sudden it's legal? How do you deal with that?
It's a great question. We've had a number of bills. Just last session, we had more than 30 bills that dealt with marijuana as we continue to struggle to try and get to the right policy goal. And a huge aspect of that is collateral consequences. As a convicted person, regardless of whether or not it's a misdemeanor or a felony, you have downstream impacts on your life, your livelihood, your ability to be employed, your ability to maintain licensure for various, whether or not you're a dietitian or a doctor or you're cutting somebody's hair, all those things are regulated by the state, and most of those things come with restrictions on felonious behavior. We have a big push now to deal with those collateral consequences. And I think that's relevant to the caretaker debate that's going on here in Florida. But no, it absolutely exists. And when you decriminalize and that risk assessment goes down, people begin to become more and more accepting. The likelihood of diminishing the impact of somebody's past illegal behavior goes with it.
And Professor Mikos, you mentioned earlier that there's too many cooks in the kitchen.
Cooks, not crooks.
No. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. You have different regulations at different level. I'm assuming you're kind of talking about a localism issue. You have perhaps in Denver, Colorado, it's legal for dispensary to have dispensaries, and then in nearby Aurora. Am I saying that right? Aurora? Sure. It was, I think, until recently, you couldn't have dispensaries. So how does that, this is really a question for both Dr. Kilmer and Professor Mikos, how does that affect this research on seeing what works and what doesn't?
Well, I think both it affects research, and it also, you can take a step back and try to ask yourself if you can divorce yourself from your views about marijuana legalization, whether you're for it or against it, and ask yourself which level of government should have control and the final say over this policy. I would suspect that you'd say it's not local governments. Part of the problem when you have Denver, which is immediately next door to Aurora, and I think Aurora's policy is not going to change, you're going to see on a map, if you do a Google map for marijuana dispensaries in Denver, you're going to see right along the boundary with Aurora, you've got a bunch of dispensaries located right there. So what happens in Denver doesn't stay there, to borrow a marketing phrase from another big metropolis. And that's problematic from sort of a constitutional structure perspective, because if there are externalities to the activities in Denver, if Denver has a factory that is polluting the water of Aurora, of course you might think, well, this isn't an issue that should be decided in Denver. Aurora ought to have a say through the state legislature. So from a constitutional perspective, you can say there's a normative argument to be made for pushing this up to a higher level of government. But I think it also impacts the research side, which is that if you're trying to study, okay, what's the impact of dispensaries in Denver on use in Denver and on sales there, we have to take into account that there are a lot of people from Aurora and other parts of the state, Colorado Springs and so on, who are going into Denver to buy their pipe and taking it back home and maybe driving under the influence and so on. So it makes it very difficult to actually get, I think, good results. It's one of these complicating factors that Beau talked about earlier.
Well, I'd like to just clarify a few things that my worthy colleague Dr. Hart said and a few other issues that have been raised here. There is a definition of intoxication that we have to be clear about. I noticed the audience clapped when he said he wants to have his intoxicant, and I appreciate that, vote of confidence for him. But there are many definitions of intoxication, and from the perspective of a biologist, intoxication means a loss of one's normal sensory interoceptive perceptions, which means that your mind is no longer functioning the way it normally does. With regard to oxycodone derivatives, as we all know, they have very significant side effects, but they do not intoxicate the way that a high or a stoner would call marijuana, meaning that you will be sedated, you may have a depersonalization, but you can function under those conditions. Under a high dose of marijuana, you're compromised very significantly in terms of learning, memory, and also sensory perception. So I think we have to clarify that point. And that's, being able to define the psychoactive effects of drugs that are in Schedule 1 is a critical piece of this. I think the second issue that has not been raised here, which you introduced so eloquently, is this vast change in public perception with regard to medical marijuana or legalization of marijuana. Where is it coming from? And one of the most critical issues, and here I will have to deviate from science into a level of politics, and that is that so many of the articles, ads, lobbying groups that have put massive amounts of money, the estimates are up to upwards of $100 million into promoting and advocating for the safety of marijuana. That has been driving this issue. And the real issue that I think we all face is the simple question, is marijuana safe? If it were safe, if it were broccoli, if it were celery, we wouldn't be here. If it were safe, there would be zero need for marijuana to be put on ballot initiatives in order to circumvent the Food and Drug Administration. Because that's basically what this medicalization movement is all about. It's to circumvent rigorous scientific standards using evidence that would not pass the first phase of most of the FDA's approval process. And so to go to the public, how does one accomplish this? One accomplishes this by ads, by going to editorial offices of newspapers and so on. In my case, when this bill came up in Massachusetts, I went to the editorial office of the Boston Globe with a team of people. We presented the scientific evidence, the absence thereof, to the editorial board, and they wrote an editorial saying, vote no on this issue of approving marijuana as medicine. year later in Wikipedia, I noticed that that editorial had been absent from the Wikipedia site on marijuana as medicine. And so I had the exact terminology which I accessed. I put it in, and in real time, it was erased. I put it in again, in real time, it was erased. I put it in 4 times, and it was erased. There is a team of people that have been hired to try to suppress the opinions and the scientific evidence against marijuana. So I would categorize the debate based on profiling the people who have opinions. The first group of people are the people who know the science well and who are either dismissive or parse it. The second group of people are the deniers. And just like the tobacco CEOs who testified in front of Congress in the early 1990s, they raise the right hand and say marijuana is not addictive. The side effects are trivial. The third group of people who have opinions on this are the people who are uninformed of the science. And getting the science information to the public has been a daunting task because of the lack of will or the inability of many of the people who are in the media to listen to the information. So I think we have a very, very difficult situation in terms of both legalization and both marijuana as medicine in terms of educating the public, first and foremost on the FDA process, because that is something that every conscientious person should understand, and how rigorous it is, and that's why our drug safety profiles are they are the best, I think, in the world. The second issue that we have to recognize is that marijuana as medicine, what is marijuana? It is a plant. THC levels can vary from 1 to 15%, in some preparations up to 30 or 60%. That's not a medicine in terms of dose response. The FDA will not approve a medicine unless you know exactly what the dose range is that will be effective, what the therapeutic window is, what the safety window is. And in this case, we not only don't have those kind of data in the literature, but we don't have any information on long-term safety consequences of people who are taking this for chronic diseases, not terminal, not compassionate category, but chronic diseases. In many states, I've excavated the data for 3 states in which marijuana has been recommended and acquired through dispensaries. The vast majority in these 3 states, over 90%, are using it for pain. Now, what is pain? There are few trials on neuropathic pain, which is very different than ordinary pain. Neuropathic pain is pain damage. It is damage to nerve cells. It's not the kind of pain that you get from a backache or from blunt trauma. There's no science on pain other than neuropathic pain. So what I am trying to convey to you is that the ballot initiative for the public, which doesn't really have a sense of what the FDA process is, doesn't have a sense of what the evidence is for many of the diseases that are listed in these initiatives, and does not know what meta-analysis and excavation of the data has said thus far, this is the wrong way to go.
So, Dr. Hart, I think you would probably want to respond. The first point I'm curious is the actual process of researching that marijuana.
Yeah, so I think we have a lot of common ground, actually, Dr. Ventures and I. We really agree on this notion of people who actually know the science should be involved in this conversation. So me personally, I have given thousands of doses of marijuana to people in the lab and carefully studied it, largely because of your tax dollars, so thank you. So when we think about intoxicants, as you pointed out, now I have studied methamphetamine, amphetamine, the drug that's an Adderall. Methamphetamine and Adderall are essentially the same drug. So when you talk about intoxicant, both of those drugs, amphetamines, are FDA approved. They are Schedule II drugs. They certainly produce intoxication. So I think that the comment about marijuana producing this intoxication such that people are not themselves, that's a bit of hyperbole. Hey, hang on. When we think about intoxicating effects of drugs, the most important thing that we think about when it comes to drugs is dose, the amount of drug that one takes. Now, certainly, you can get some intoxicating effects with marijuana to the point that people may behave in ways that they wouldn't normally behave. That's absolutely true. The same is true for morphine, OxyContin, a number of drugs. The same is true from amphetamine. That's absolutely right, but that's related to dose. And this notion, the notion that was raised earlier about the marijuana that people are smoking today is not the marijuana that was smoked previously. Again, that's part of hyperbole. There has always been, since marijuana has been around, there has always been knowledge in order to increase the THC concentration of marijuana. We've always had that ability. It's just that the average concentration has recently risen. That's absolutely true. When the average THC concentration has risen, what that means is people don't have to smoke as much. It's just like thinking about drinking a stiff alcoholic drink versus drinking a beer. You don't drink the two the same. We've studied this in the lab. We've looked at this in the lab. So that concerns me. People confuse those sorts of things. And when we think about bias, when we think about real bias, there is bias in the scientific literature. 90% of the world's research on all of these drugs, marijuana, all the drugs of abuse, is funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which I am an advisory council member. The National Institute on Drug Abuse's mission is to focus on drug abuse, drug addiction, pathology. That means that the overwhelming majority of the information that's published in the scientific literature focuses on pathology. That does not mean that the overwhelming majority of the effects of these drugs, when they're taken, is pathological, but you get a skewed perspective when you look in the scientific literature. This comes from someone who has published nearly 100 papers in that same literature. Someone who reviews papers published in that literature. Someone who also reviews grants that are submitted to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And so when we have these kind of discussions, it's important for us not to confuse these various issues. Another issue that was raised earlier was this notion that when marijuana or a drug is perceived not to be harmful, drug use goes up. That's a confusion. We don't know what came first. This is simply a correlation. We don't know if that's the reason that drug use increased, or we don't know if people are smoking the drug and they realize that it's not as harmful as they have been told. We don't know which came first. So that's a simple sort of correlation, causation sort of confusion. So it's important for people not to get confused on those kind of issues.
Well, I had two follow-up questions for both of you. What is the actual, my understanding of Schedule I under the Controlled Substances Act is that it's fairly difficult to actually do research on to reclassify that. Is that true?
I will give you a very powerful example. The Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research in California was funded in the year 1999 to 2000 by then Governor Gray Davis. Because after Proposition 215 was passed in California, they then decided, well, is marijuana beneficial? This proposition enabled the recommendation of marijuana as medicine. And then they decided after the fact, well, let's create the evidence after the fact. So they had a seed money through I believe it was a Senate bill in the California House, in the California Senate for $8 million that kick-started the program. And in all this time, we're now 2014, it started around 2000, it got off to a very slow start. There have been approximately 42 publications, and including abstracts. Of those 42 publications, there are 5. 4 on HIV and neuropathic pain, and 1 on spasticity and multiple sclerosis. What is so fascinating about it is that they had to cancel 5 major studies on cancer pain, and I won't list all of them, because they could not find more than 1 to 3 patients volunteering for these studies. Now, they have access to marijuana cigarettes from 0%, which means the THC has been removed, up to 9.4%. There are more than 11 people currently in the country who have FDA approval to conduct clinical trials with marijuana. There are over 111 scientists who can conduct clinical trials. The Schedule 1 issue is a non-issue. If you have good credentials, if you can fulfill the requirements of the FDA and DEA in terms of control of substances, in terms of your own training, in terms of patient consent forms, and all the other issues, you can do the science. This is a canard that has been put forward in order to pressure the rescheduling of marijuana.
Dr. Teitelbaum, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think that, a couple of things, Carl, I was listening to. First of all, the example of prescription drugs is a poor example because, A, with respect to your, reference to oxycodone, the opiates are a great example. They're not intoxicating for everybody. Some people take them for pain and get sedated and fall asleep on their couch. Other people get a sense of well-being and energy. So a reaction to a drug is not always the same for everybody. There's brain reward, there's motivation, there's memory, there's inhibition. There's a lot of things that go into how one reacts to a drug. But the prescription drug issue is a good example because we kept talking about Adderall, which is amphetamine, not methamphetamine. If you look at the opioids and you look at chronic pain, and you look at the psychostimulants for attention deficit disorder, some people truly do suffer from attention deficit disorder. They need the medication. But we have a national epidemic of abuse of prescription drugs. So just because a drug is legal and just because a drug is available doesn't mean a drug can't be abused. And opiates are a great example. Opiate addiction, which is, our state was the laughingstock of the country with pill mills. We prescribed more oxycodone for more people that didn't need it. People came from multiple states using pain as a vehicle to get drugs. Ruined family lives, respiratory arrests, deaths, warped lives, blaming children. That was prescription drugs, that was legal. And so now we have to ask, okay, are we going to do the same thing by making another drug available to a lot of people who don't really need it? So I don't think the example of prescription drugs is a good example of something that worked well. We've had an epidemic of prescription drugs that our state continues to fight, and not the only state. And I think, the other thing people talk about illnesses, people with drug use disorders and alcoholism and drug addiction, it's an illness, like mental illness, it's an illness of stigma. So the people are not going to be jumping up and down in the audience saying, I've had a problem. I had a problem with marijuana. I had a problem with alcohol. These people, that's why it's Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous. There's a lot of shame-based. There's a lot of people not willing to kind of come out. And so when we talk about illnesses, we do have to recognize when you do look at statistics and you do look at the history of addiction and recovery in the United States, we've got a problem. And there's a lot of people kind of that will be affected. So I think sometimes when I hear the discussion and I hear it go back to the prescription drugs, I don't think that's a good analogy. And I don't think that people kind of talk like every person reacts the same way to drugs. That's just not true. There's many people in this audience that can drink with impunity, and there's a fair amount of people in this audience that don't have any business drinking. because they're going to get into trouble. So I think we have to remember that. We've learned, science has taught us a lot more about the neurobiology of drugs and people, genetic predisposition to addiction, and the epigenetics, the relationship between one's genetics and environment, and other psychological issues that influence that. And it's not something that people like to talk about because it's an illness of a lot of stigma and shame.
Well, let me respond. Just 1 second. You're absolutely right in that. I absolutely agree that there are a number of factors to be considered. But the thing is that the notion that people don't respond to drugs is saying, we can predict a lot about how people respond. Tolerance is critically important because when you talk about this issue of opioids not inducing intoxication, it certainly induces intoxication to people who have less tolerance compared to those people who don't have tolerance. We've studied these drugs in the lab, and we've studied them in thousands of people. And so we study this so we actually know how people respond. And that's science. That's number one. And number two, when you talk about Adderall not being the same as methamphetamine, again, there have been at least 3 studies, I've conducted one, in which they are. They are exactly the same drug in terms of effects in people. The science is absolutely clear on that. That's not up for debate. If you look at the literature, it's clear.
So, Professor Mikos, you wanted to add in?
I was just going to say that I sympathize with the point that, in a sense, we ought to trust the judgments of expert agencies and distinguished physicians and medical doctors concerning the addiction risks of substances like marijuana. But that's a far cry from saying that we ought to, therefore, turn over the keys to the FDA and the DEA to craft our drug policy. It's only one consideration. And sort of the elephant in the room that no one's discussing. We're making these analogies to prescription drugs, but there's also alcohol and nicotine, which are 2 psychoactive substances which are legal. They're not even under the Controlled Substances Act. They're sort of carved out from that. So we have other models that we could follow. We could say that this is a worrisome substance, that we're worried about people using the substance and how they might behave under it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to criminalize it. There are other models for dealing with that, maybe other ways that are more effective at dealing with these abuses, or you might even subscribe to a political philosophy that says, hey, if someone wants to ruin their life and get addicted to a drug, that's their business. As long as it doesn't affect me, that's not my business. So I think this is an important input, but I don't want the conversation to get dominated by these concerns over risks of a drug. There's a second side to that where voters and politicians probably are, and lawyers are probably more adept at dealing with these other issues, dealing with civil liberties and the appropriate response to these risks that are identified by
Yeah.
And Mr. Blake, you in Colorado when you were implementing 64, you served on a task force that had to come up with, I guess, guidelines and regulations to ensure responsible use. I guess we'll make the analogy to alcohol. Was that something, when looking at Colorado, when looking at that system, you were trying to come up with a way that would work?
Sure. What you're referring to is obviously recreational, and a lot of the discussion here has been about medical. This is a primary point that when I speak to folks, particularly states that are considering that, you cannot understand the breadth and complexity of the issues of creating this overnight commodity that has been otherwise illegal and remains illegal federally, how those policy determinations work. I mean, my focus is not on the studies or the medicinal qualities, it's been on the process. How do you do it? How do you regulate it? Should it be regulated? Can you over-regulate it? Does it actually eliminate a black market? How do you get a product that is safe? It doesn't have mold. The labeling can be read and understood by people. How do you keep it out of the hands of youth when you have one gummy bear that looks the same as another gummy bear and one's infused with marijuana and the other isn't? What are the economic impacts of it? Tax. What are the costs to the government to actually fund the enforcement? It costs more to buy marijuana than it does an ounce of gold. When you think about it as an economic benefit, which adds more to society, something that's going to be consumed at that rate, or something that's an investment of some kind. These are all things that we struggle with and continue to struggle. A lot of people look at Colorado as an example of, frankly, a success of implementation. And I think that's right. Coming from somebody who opposed the amendment and still opposes the policy, that's no longer my goal. My role in the world is now to, I'm ethically bound to be the lawyer for Colorado and try and get it right. We haven't gotten it right yet, and it's been 5 years. So any state that's going to step into the breach here and take this on, don't assume that overnight you're going to look like Colorado. You can spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of toil, trying to get there. And from the medical side, this debate is going to continue. I promise that it's been going for 20 years. It's going to go for 20 more.
Yeah.
And we're in this kind of long run experiment in Colorado. And I think there are lessons that are being learned. There are clearly some of them have been. It's abundantly clear that some of the things that we struggled with in Colorado have been adopted and were neutralized in the Florida amendment, just to use it as an example. There are also lessons, and I refer to the other, this kind of amorphous other disease or debilitating disease as one, where it's going to get abused. People are going to drive a truck through that. Doctors are going to make money off of this. Again, from my expertise is much more in the observations. We had doctors. It's kind of amusing. Set up an RV outside of a Fish concert. They charge $250 for every consultation. They went in one end of the RV, walked out the other, and they had their recommendation. That's going to occur here. We've stopped it, but we had to go through those growing pains. This is tough stuff from a policy perspective, and you can't comprehend it. It's fascinating to me, the challenges that walk in my door every single day.
So Dr. Madras, you want to respond to Professor Mikos?
Yes, I think because we're in a law forum, the first question to ask is, what is the purpose of laws? The purpose of laws is to control human behavior. And in some cases, obviously, it's property laws and criminal violence. In the case of drugs, the behaviors can range all the way from death to others that are more and more difficult to develop a consensus on. So if a drug will cause death or violence or criminality, there's a clear-cut, responsible and reliable set of standards that we can impose laws. With regard to the other consequences, in this case of marijuana and its legal status, there are value systems that are involved, and no scientist, no politician, no human being can arrive at a consensus with regard to certain values that we have. But I will just ask the audience for very simple questions. With regard to the acute effects of marijuana, how many of you are aware that it will impede learning, memory, sense of time, sense of distance, in certain cases promote anxiety, as well as paranoia? How many of you are aware, taken chronically, a daily user will progress to addiction 50% of the time? Taken chronically, you have a much higher risk for developing a psychosis and or schizophrenia, a higher risk, especially with early age of onset, of lowering IQ by 8 points, a higher risk for engendering lung problems, a higher risk for testicular cancer, a higher risk for having brain changes, including a shrinking of the part of the brain that's critical for learning and memory, the hippocampus. And for adolescents, if an adolescent initiates marijuana use at the age of 14 or younger, the prevalence of addiction when they grow up is 5 to 6 times higher than if they initiate at the age of 21. For adolescents, the incidence of psychosis is increased. For adolescents, the risk for lowering of IQ is increased. For adolescents, school dropouts are increased, engaging in delinquency, and so on and so forth. And recently, this is preclinical studies. These are in rodents, but rodents can tell you an enormous amount because rodents don't have stress factors, abusing parents, exam deadlines. They're genetically identical. If you introduce THC in a male during adolescence, long before he mates, long before he has an opportunity to have a female partner, and then withdraw the THC, wait until he grows up, introduces a female partner, their offspring will seek heroin at higher rates, which implies that there's an epigenetic change in the sperm that precedes conception by a very fixed amount of time. There are so many factors that the science tells us that, from my perspective, has very profound value in making these decisions. But there are many people, I think, who vote on these issues that are unaware of them.
So we're going to go to Dr. Teitelbaum and follow up with Dr. Hart. Dr. Teitelbaum, you studied you were a pediatrician for years, you studied the youth effects. What do you agree with Dr. Madras?
I do, and I want to go back to something that Professor Mikos said that I think is important. He looked at, we have a couple of drugs, we're talking about prescription drugs, and he looked at tobacco and alcohol. And I would challenge people and I would say, okay, we get taxes, we make them legal. What's the morbidity and mortality with tobacco and alcohol nationally? And it's quite significant. As a matter of fact, there is more deaths from tobacco and alcohol than all illicit substances combined. So the point, I think, which he makes, which is an eloquent point, is that people might want the right to say, well, I have the right to ruin my life and I have the right to do that. The problem I have with that, it's not so simple because it's not just one person's life. So if somebody's out today driving intoxicated, or, as I sit here, it's ironic, and I don't want to overly focus on the addiction issues, but there's at Florida Recovery Center this weekend, there's a family weekend. Try to tell the families that the drugs just influenced the person using them. It won't work. And I want to go back and I want to say tobacco and alcohol, yes, they're legal. Yes, we generate tax revenue. But when we look at the tax revenue that we generate, I believe there's almost $8 to $10 more spent on public health issues. And so I understand the idea, just like we'll go to alcohol, that many people want the right to drink and have a good time, and that there's a fair amount of people that struggle with that, and again, DUIs and get into trouble. And the challenge I have, and I ask people voting, is, do you want to add another drug to that? Do you want another added drug that's going to cause significant morbidity, significant mortality, and significant public health issues? And that's, I think, the challenge, and you articulated well. It's beyond a medical decision, it's a societal decision. But I struggle when sometimes people hide behind science. And I struggle with that. I think sometimes we do that. We spin things to fit what we want to believe in.
So Dr. Hart, Dr. Madras mentioned that laws are for controlling behavior. And I think one of the most devastating arguments that have been made, devastating to opponents of legalization, is that alcohol is legal. There are about 88,000 deaths related to alcohol. We do control that behavior in some way. Obviously, there's a cost. What are your thoughts?
I have so many thoughts. I'm thinking I'm in 1937 all over again by some of the comments that are made. I don't know how to respond because Dr. Madras listed a litany of studied kind of findings without contextualizing things. And I don't want to bore you all, but this is what I do. I love this sort of stuff. So when we think about cognition, I have, as I pointed out, given thousands of doses of marijuana and tested cognition and tested all of these sorts of things. I don't want anyone to leave here today thinking that marijuana is innocuous. It is not. It's a psychoactive drug. no psychoactive drug is innocuous. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that you can smoke, and you can go to the literature if you have time to read the boring literature. You can go to the literature, and you will see that people smoke marijuana, report euphoria, and don't have any of these changes in cognition that we just heard. Yes, there are people who can have dramatic changes, and those are the people who are naive users, who are novice, and if they take large dose, yes, you can get many of these effects. But that's true for any psychoactive drug. And so I don't want to respond to each one of those sorts of things, like the lowering of the IQ study. If you look at that study where they took the study looked at about 20 people who started smoking marijuana before 18 on a regular basis versus those who did not start smoking marijuana on a regular basis. And they saw that the people who started smoking marijuana on a regular basis before 18 had about 8 points lower IQ than folks who waited later. That's absolutely right. But then if you look at the IQ, everybody's IQ is in the normal range. It's not like they are functioning below norm. And then we know nothing about these people's occupation. We don't know whether or not they are blue-collar sort of workers versus people who are doing more white-collar sort of jobs that require more cognitions. We don't know. But the point is they stay within the normal range. And so as you, Florida, go forward, I don't know what you should do. But what I do think you should do is think about the entire picture. So when we think about drug addiction and drug abuse, people have said things like, think about the families. Ask the families what the families think. How about we ask the families of all of those people who are arrested every year and get criminal laws and cannot work and pay taxes? How about we ask their families what they think about our current regulation of these drugs?
So I have one follow-up question. I want to go to Dr. Kilmer. How do we define, I guess, marijuana addiction? And we have alcohol withdrawal. Dr. Hart, is there also marijuana withdrawal?
Yes, there is marijuana withdrawal. That's absolute. We have published at least 10 papers on marijuana withdrawal. People who smoke marijuana every day, multiple cigarettes a day, and then we abruptly stop their marijuana use. You can see withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms are things like sleep disruptions, decreased food intake, more irritability. It looks similar to tobacco withdrawal. And so it's irritating, that's a fact, but it's not life-threatening. But it's certainly a real phenomenon.
And Dr. Kilmer, how many people are, would you say, dependent on marijuana? And how many people are dependent on other legal substances, such as alcohol?
Well, the numbers, so there's this one study that always gets cited. So some researchers, it was based on some work, some surveys that were done in the 90s. They'll look at individuals who began using and then look at whether or not they ever experienced issues related to their use of, whether they met clinical criteria for abuse or dependence. And so the numbers that get thrown around is for cannabis, it's about 9%. So 9%, 10% of the people who use marijuana that at sometime within 10 years experienced enough symptoms where they would have been clinically dependent. For alcohol, it's about 15%. I think for cocaine, it was about 16%. Heroin, 25%. So that's kind of one way of kind of looking at this. But you have to remember, a lot of those studies were done a long time ago. And so, we're in a new world now when it comes to marijuana research. And, yes, there are these health harms associated with consumption. But the thing is both sides can bring up 5 peer-reviewed studies which say the exact opposite thing. And it may not be that they're necessarily incorrect. The issue is a lot of these studies, we don't know what type of marijuana was being used, especially in these longitudinal surveys. We don't know the potency. We don't know how frequently people were consuming. So I think regardless of how you feel about what's happening in Colorado and Washington, one thing we're going to see is I think we're going to get some better information about what people are actually consuming. Because I think that's part of one of the issues why in some of these cases, why you see a lot of conflicting evidence here. Whether or not it was, you're looking at a cohort of kids from New Zealand in the 1970s and following them for 40 years, or you're looking at kids living in California in the 1990s who had access to very different types of marijuana. I think that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. But that said, just because we've got studies on this that say this on this side and we've got this many on this side, it doesn't mean we have to throw up our hands and say that we don't have any science on this. I mean, some studies are just better than others. But the difficulty is if you're trying to figure out whether or not a cancer drug works, you'll get what the FDA does is you get 400 people with that suffer from cancer. Half of them will get the actual cancer drug, half will get a placebo. Nobody will know, and you'll follow them over time. And that's how you kind of learn. It's really hard to do that for marijuana. We don't just give a whole class of 8th graders a bunch of marijuana and then another class no marijuana, kind of follow them over time. But that's why, that's the gold standard for research. And so that's why once you get below that gold standard, it comes into statistical models and it comes into the assumptions you make. And you kind of put that on top of the fact that we don't necessarily have good information on what was being consumed. This is why there's a lot of uncertainty here.
So time flies when we're having fun, and there are flights to be caught and delays to be inevitably had in Atlanta. I want to ask all of you for some closing statements, short statements, possible.
What's short?
2 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, because they charge us after we go over 2. And we'll start with you, David Blake.
Well, let me briefly respond to the question, because what we're seeing in real time in Colorado is a couple of statistics. He's clearly on trends, he's clearly on studies. Obviously, whatever metric you apply is one of the great debates. But we recently did a supply and demand study. What we're seeing is 70% of the actual market is driven by daily users, chronic users. We've seen in the mountain towns, the tourist towns, the towns that rely on out-of-state dollars, 90% of the folks who are occupying that market are coming from out of state. We have seen increases. You said 9%. I've seen some numbers higher, some lower. But pretty much across the board in all of those studies, Colorado's rates are higher. I go back to the process and the abuse question. It's the abuse of the process, not the abuse of the drug necessarily, that concerns me. You see these risk assessments go down. You see it among youth. And I hear clapping. We can't see the crowd exactly from here, but I'm betting a lot of the people that are clapping are probably under the age of 30. Well, that's not the population of people that you would typically think of as qualifying for cancer or some of these other debilitating diseases. What they will qualify for is severe pain or chronic pain, one of these other much more amorphous things. And that, I think, is an abuse. If, in fact, you're intending for medicinal marijuana to benefit a particular percentage of people for pain, and you believe it, and I don't question that. That's not my position to question. I don't have the know-how to question it. That population of people is much, much smaller than the population of people that will actually be using and is using in all of these states that have decriminalized. So I think that's my takeaway from my experience. It's just the abuse of the process. You can't get around it. And once you put it in the Constitution, you are stuck with it. You're stuck with the ambiguities, you're stuck with all the related litigation, you're stuck with the good and the bad. That's exactly.
Dr. Hart?
Okay. I don't really know how to close, but I'll just say that as we think about moving forward, we have to think about how we got here and why we are here. We are here in part because in the United States, we have been dishonest. Not only about marijuana, we've been dishonest about a number of drugs and the effects of these drugs. And as a result, that's why we have these ballot initiatives. The general population kind of knows that we've been dishonest. I don't know if that's the right way to go with these ballot initiatives. I don't know. But what I do know is that the science has exaggerated the harms associated with marijuana. Now, that's not to say that you all should go out and smoke marijuana or we should even make it more available. I don't know. But I know we have, as a scientist, exaggerated the harms. And as we move forward, one of the things that I'm looking forward to, and that's happening with me as I participate on these types of panels. For example, David and I may have had completely different views before coming here. But after talking with someone like David, who's reasonable, who has this experience, I've learned a tremendous amount. I just hope that the public and other so-called experts do the same sort of things. Learn from other people and learn with an open mind, because I know I have learned a tremendous amount. Thank you.
What should we think about going forward?
Well, I think in the grand scheme of things, you have to put this in perspective. And so you've got prohibition on one side, and then you've got kind of what's happening in Colorado and Washington, where you've got for-profit companies that are coming in and producing and distributing marijuana. Realize there's a lot of policy space in between prohibition and allowing marijuana to be sold like alcohol. So if you're a jurisdiction and you're thinking about doing something other than marijuana prohibition because you don't want to spend those criminal justice resources and you don't want individuals getting those permanent records, there are a number of things you could do. You could allow home production, you could create co-ops, you could have nonprofits doing it. Or if you're outside of the United States, you could actually have a state monopoly where the state actually produces it and then controls the prices in charge of regulation. That can keep the prices up and it can reduce the potential for advertising, which is a big concern once you go to the for-profit model. That said, that particular option doesn't get a lot of attention in the United States because states can't force their employees to violate federal law. But outside of the United States, that is a possible option. So the bottom line is that when you think about legalization, I don't necessarily just want you to think about Washington and Colorado. As a researcher, I'm paying really close attention to what happens in those states, and I have an open mind. But realize there are other options between these, and also, when you make a change, it doesn't necessarily have to be permanent. You could build in sunset provisions. You could say, you know what, we're going to try a nonprofit model for 5 years, and then at the end of 5 years, we'll let the voters or the policymakers decide whether or not to continue down that path or go some other way. And so these are, if you're going to go down this path, you have options. Because, as David suggested, once you go from prohibition to the for-profit model, and when you have a for-profit model with lobbyists, and if you decide 10 years later you want to try something different, it's a lot harder to put that genie back in the bottle. So realize there's a lot of debate about the science here, but also when you think about different options, there are a lot of options that aren't being discussed, and the changes you make don't necessarily have to be permanent.
Madras, where do we go from here?
David Musto, a great medical historian, recorded the history of our drug laws with regard to opiates and cocaine in the early 19th century. And he said, at the beginning, everyone thought these were elixirs of life. They were euphoriants, they were heavenly, and there were proponents in the medical community and others. And then reality hit. They were mugged by reality because families, communities, law enforcement began to see the consequences of these drugs, not simply on the lives of the individuals who had addiction problems, but on others, because drug use is not a victimless activity. And then he said, gradually, as these consequences built up, we began to implement and write laws in order to combat and push back the waters. From the early 1900s until today, opioid use worldwide, globally, dropped by over 90% as a consequence of international conventions and other regulatory statutes. In the US, it's dropped by over 67% for the same reason. My feeling is that we are embarking on the same type of experiment now with marijuana. And in 30 years from now, we will see the fallout of what I consider uninformed consent, especially amongst young people who are really unaware of these consequences. And in 30 years from now, our nation will take another look at this. So I don't think that the jury is in, but I do think that we may end up losing a significant proportion of our youth to these brain consequences. And so I'd like to just show you this t-shirt that was produced by some of my Swedish friends who quote me because I always finish a conversation on these issues by saying, this is not a war on drugs. This is a defense of our brains. Thank you.
Mr. Mikos, what's the future of marijuana policy and law?
Well, I hate to make those predictions, but I'll try to end on just an education note. In thinking about your own stances on marijuana legalization, whether you're for it, against it, I think you ought to take into consideration three different things that we've talked about here today. One is that you ought to delve in and try to figure out what are the harms and potential benefits of this drug. And don't be intimidated by the scientific literature. I encourage you to look into it and read it for yourself, but also don't stop there. Because I think you want to, after you do that, you also want to consider for yourself, which are these harms, if you believe they exist, are harms that it's appropriate for the government to address. So it may be one thing if someone is going out there using marijuana and then driving recklessly and getting in an accident and hurting someone else, you may say that's a good area for the government to get involved. But if we're talking about a 30-year-old who uses marijuana and reduces her IQ by 5 points, is that something that justifies government intervention? And then lastly, you've got the harms that you believe in, you know what role government should play in your opinion. Think about the best way to react to those harms. Is it prohibition? Is it a paternalistic policy where we say we don't trust people to make their choices for themselves, we're just not going to give them that option? Do we think that even works? Or is it more of an education policy? We try to make sure that people are aware of the true costs and potential benefits of this drug. So those are the different things I think you should consider in formulating your own opinions on this. I'll leave aside my own opinions, but that's sort of the framework I think you should use.
Teitelbaum, where do we go from here?
Well, I don't know where we go from here. I'm grateful to be part of this, and I'm grateful that the conversation was real with respect to legalization. I think the idea, I think it was well articulated about voting on medicalization, having the average patient being 20 years old with chronic back pain that they don't have is a joke. So I think this is a real decision, and I think it's a socio-cultural decision. People have to kind of weigh things. I would ask people not to be blinded by their own biases and what they want to do, to take a look and really consider things. I'm not in the business of putting people away. When Carl had said about families, nobody in my field wants to see people go to prison for smoking marijuana. I'm in the treatment world and want to help people. So when I look at this, I would ask people, is there a way to not have it be criminal, but there's a way to use the system where we get people the help that they need and allow people, there are some people out there that can drink and smoke with impunity. I understand that. But I'm in my role is in trying to help and educate healthcare professionals about these issues and treat people. So I would ask people, as Professor Mikos articulated, to really kind of take a look and put their own biases aside. I would say with respect to Amendment 2, nobody would like this. I vote no. But the legalization, I understand the discussion. The medicalization is a Trojan horse, and it's really been a farce of a conversation. And I think that was well articulated by our Colorado friend.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been really fascinating to hear all different viewpoints. I wish we could probably have stayed and talked for like 8 hours, but why don't we give all of our panelists a big round of applause.